The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Representative Tom Suozzi on the newly formed Labor Caucus and its promise to prioritize working families and unions. Caleb Jackson on the legal case against voter suppression, plus Bill Press with Julian Castro on what's really going on at the border. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Congressman Tom Suozzi says the idea of getting behind working people should be something that unites every Democrat. And now is the time to get past our differences to do that. And we say hello to Congressman Tom Suozzi, who represents the 3rd Congressional District in New York. He's a member of the powerful House Ways and Means Committee, serving on both the Oversight and Tax Policy subcommittees. Congressman Suozzi, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Hey, Jim, thanks so much for having me on.
Oh, certainly our pleasure. One of your many responsibilities in Congress is that you serve as co-chair of the newly formed House Labor Caucus. The creation of a Labor Caucus wasn't announced until November of last year, about 5 months ago. Why did this need to happen, and why now, the timing of it?
There are so many different factors, but the bottom line is that America's working people are not making enough money. The American dream is very simple. You go to work, and in return for working hard, you make enough money so you can have a place to live, you can educate your kids, you can have health insurance, and you can retire one day without being scared. That's just not a reality for too many people. The reason Trump became popular, the reason Bernie Sanders became popular is because of a source of frustration for working people in our country. The system's not working for them. And so, I'm 58 years old. I was born in 1962. And when I was growing up, the Democrats were for the working people and the Republicans were for the fat cats. And that's kind of been blurred over the years. Also, when I was growing up in the 1980s, we went through this whole thing when we were fighting Japan and Germany over the car industry. And we were worried about losing everything. And so we changed the way we did things in America. And it worked. We created enormous wealth. I mean, the Dow Jones has gone up 15 times since the end of the 1980s, 1,500%. And the gross domestic product has gone up 8 times, 800%. But workers' wages have gone up less than 20%. So we need to create wealth in America. That's a good thing, but we need to share that wealth with the people who go to work every day. Labor, unions are the best vehicle to do that. And so we wanted to get the Democrats from all perspectives, from the most progressive to the most moderate Democrat, working together on a common agenda to say, we've got to help unions. We have to help labor again. We have to help working people in America again to live the American dream.
And as I mentioned a moment ago, this is one of many responsibilities that you have as a congressperson. Why did you decide to make this commitment?
This is something I feel very strongly about. I mean, my grandfather, on one side, I have a grandfather who was born in Italy, and my family lived a great American success story coming up the Italian side. On the Irish side, my other grandfather was an electrician for the IBEW Local 3, working in New York City. He put the lights on top of the Empire State Building. And, my family's had a great American dream, American success story. Labor unions were a very big part of that. And I just see that this is the challenge we face. When I was younger, we would often hear politicians saying good jobs and good wages. And, the best social program is a job. Well, after having been in politics for, more than a quarter of a century, I was elected mayor of my hometown in 1993. I just see that, we have too many people that go to work every day that work really hard and they cannot afford their health insurance. They cannot make enough money to pay for their mortgage and pay their property taxes. Nobody's got savings for their retirement. It's a big, we just went through this whole big minimum wage debate in our country, and it's still going to go on. Okay, the minimum wage at the federal level, it's bigger in New York. I'm from New York, is $7.25 an hour. Let's say it's $10 an hour. $10 an hour, 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year comes out to $20,000 a year. You can't live the American dream on $20,000 a year. Let's say it's $15 an hour. $15 an hour, 40 hours a week, that's $600. 50 weeks a year, that's $30,000. You gonna buy your health insurance? So in some places you can get by on $30,000 in America. Not in where I'm from, not in New York, you can't get by on $30,000 a year. And so we have to recognize how different it is from place to place in the country as well, because the wages in New York are very different than the wages in Oklahoma than they are in Iowa or North Dakota. So we have to we have to understand each other better. But getting people significant wages or sufficient wages for the work they do, having the skills to get those wages, are a big challenge for us that we need to face. And this president is going to get us there because as he says, I'm a union guy.
Well, and it's important to point out too, and as you well know, Congressman, there was a time when on the federal level the minimum wage went up with some consistency. I think this is the longest stretch we've had without a raise in the minimum wage, and it wouldn't be as big an issue had we just consistently gone up every few years. I don't think we'd be crying over the $15 mark, which, as you point out, isn't really enough anyway.
Yeah, there's just too many people struggling. I mean, that's just real life. Real life is that people work hard and they still can't get by. That doesn't make sense. Well, how is it possible that in America you can work hard and still be considered impoverished? I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
The American dream is turning into the American nightmare for some folks. It seems.
The pandemic showed us, like the pandemic of the economy, it's cruelly uneven. Some people emerged from the pandemic completely unscathed. Nobody got sick. They worked remotely. They got their wages. They had money in the stock market. They did, they're fine. Online retail was fine. Wall Street was fine. Other people, 25% of the people who make under $40,000 a year are still unemployed. You can't go back to work at the restaurant. You can't go back to work at the catering hall or at the live entertainment venue or the hotel, and there's nothing else to do. You don't have any other skills. It used to be that if you're willing to work hard, even if you didn't have skills, you could still get a good job at a factory, say. We've been pushing people, go to college, go to college, go to college. Okay, I'm all for going to college. I push my kids to go to college. I went to college. 60% of Americans do not graduate from college. Does that mean if you don't go to college, you should have a horrible life? No, we got to say, as Sherrod Brown says, there's a dignity to work, and you have to reward work. And we have to recognize how to treat people who don't go to college, but help them to get an apprenticeship, to help them get its skills. You can make a great living as a carpenter or electrician or as a welder. You can make a better living as a welder than you can as a lawyer in some places. So we need to reward hard work. We need to get people skills. We need to help people in so many different areas just to have a decent life.
Absolutely. Let's talk legislative goals. What are some of the most important bills that need to pass to further the interests of the Labor Caucus?
Well, the PRO Act is the most important thing, which just makes it easier to organize as a union. We've got a really exciting thing going on in America right now. There's a unionization vote going on in Alabama for an Amazon warehouse. Okay, Amazon, Alabama. I mean, who would have thought? And what it used to be an old steel town called Bessemer. So they have a history of labor there. So the vote has already taken place. It finished, I think, last Monday or so, 2 Mondays ago. And they're counting the ballots. Now, I don't know if they're going to win or not, but the fact that they're doing it is a major success. And making it easier to organize is very important. We need the National Labor Relations Board to actually have some teeth. If somebody breaks the rules, you can't just be, just don't do that again. You got to pay a fine. You got to be held accountable for breaking the rules. So minimum wage, the PRO Act, getting the National Labor Relations Board to have more teeth. Those are all very important parts of this. Getting more money for apprenticeship programs, changing our mindset. If you don't go to college, that's okay. If you don't want to go to college, you can't afford to go to college, school is not the right thing for you. But we still need to get job skills. Because in today's world, in a global economy, technological economy, the more you learn, the more you earn. Well, some people don't like book learning, but maybe they can learn a skill elsewhere. So we have to balance the whole thing between we like capitalism, it's the best system in the world, it's created more wealth, it's lifted more people out of poverty, it's created innovation. Capitalism is the best system, there's no question about that. But we're also democracy. All men and women are created equal. So just because you're not a good competitor doesn't mean you should have a rotten life. But we can't do either one too much. If we go too much all capitalism based upon competition, babies are bad competitors. Senior citizens are sometimes bad competitors. People that are unhealthy or have drug and alcohol problems or mental health problems are not good competitors. People that are unlucky are bad competitors, whatever it may be. Some people are bad competitors. Doesn't mean you're relegated to a life of misery. On the democracy side, all men and women are created equal. Let's put some rules in place to protect it. You have to find a balance between, if you do too much all capitalism, you end up with a bunch of people very successful and a bunch of people with rotten lives. If you do too much all men and women are created equal and put a bunch of rules in place, you kill the economic engine that makes our country strong and capitalism work. You got to find a balance between those two things. I think that labor unions are a big part of that equation to help us find that balance between the two.
We're speaking to New York Congressman Tom Suozzi. He's a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, serving on both the Oversight and Tax Policy subcommittees. Congressman, let's talk about labor and the right. The right's been actively attacking organized labor for decades. Do you see a possibility of bringing it back to, say, what it once was, or do you have a different vision of how labor will operate in the future?
Well, first we have to recognize that, the Republicans are trying to say, hey, we're the party of working people, okay, which is a complete myth. It's all based upon these social issues, and they're trying to get people scared. There was a great article written when I was in the 80s in the Daily News in New York by a guy named Lars Erik Nielsen. He said, the Republicans are being like pickpockets. When there's a pickpocket, one person comes and shoves you, and when that person bumps into you, the other guy, when you're distracted, picks your pocket. Well, that's what the Republicans are doing. They're pushing you. They're putting guns, gay marriage, abortion, whatever the issue may be, transgender these days. They get you all excited. When that happens, they pick your pocket because you're not paying attention. Your eye's not on the ball. We need to get back to the Democrats, and the Democrats need to do this. The Democratic Party in Congress, especially but throughout the country, it's very diverse. We got to find the things that unite us. Well, the idea of getting behind working people should be something that unites every Democrat, from the most moderate to the most progressive. We need to stop fighting each other and get together on this continuum of working for working people. We also have to recognize that labor unions are very diverse, okay? The building trade unions, the electricians and the carpenters and the plumbers, are very different than the teachers union, are very different than the manufacturers, the UAW and the steel industry, and very different than the hospital workers or the hospitality workers. Are very different from the public employees. I mean, there's a lot of diversity in unions, and they have the same mission, but it's not always the exact same message. And the Democrats need to do a much better job of looking at our progressive agenda. Okay, we want to address, climate change. We want to address immigration. We want to address civil rights and racism. We want to address economic growth. We want to be in trade policy. Okay, that's fine. Those are all things we should be doing. I fully support all of those agendas. We should be looking at each of those agenda items through the lens of how does this affect working people? So if we want to get rid of the Keystone Pipeline, which, we did, the president was one of the first things he did, let's do an infrastructure project in that same neighborhood at the same time to have people build some new roads and new bridges or a new dam or a new utility or something that will put those same people to work in a job. Not some theoretical thing for the future, but something that's happening at the same time. And so this president, with his big infrastructure bill and his broad definition of infrastructure, I think gets that. How can we create jobs for people that will use their skills to make good wages?
It's something, because as you're talking about it, and it's what's so obvious to me, and I don't understand why it's not to people on the right, but an infrastructure bill, building bridges, building roads, all of that kind of thing, those are automatically jobs. Those are all new jobs. And so what do you do when you have a job? You spend your money.
Right.
This is not brain surgery. If I can figure this out, they should be able to figure it out as well.
For every dollar you spend on a tax cut, you get back like 30, 40 cents. For every dollar you spend on an infrastructure project, you get back over $2. So it's a great investment. Everybody, listen, every politician, every Democrat, every Republican, every progressive, every conservative, they're all in favor of infrastructure. Let's build, let's fix the roads, let's do the sewers, let's do, broadband, school, expand the definition. Let's do it. Okay, how are we going to pay for it? When everything's said and done, the Republicans don't want to pay for it. Even some Democrats don't want to pay for it. You got to pay for it, which involves, as the president suggested, raising corporate taxes. So, or other taxes. I'm in favor of raising the gas tax. The president doesn't like that, so I'll leave that alone. I want to get the state and local tax deduction back. That's a very big issue for me. But the bottom line is we're going to have to pay for an infrastructure project. When everything's said and done, the Republicans say, I'm for infrastructure. They're not going to raise the corporate taxes. They're not going to put the top individual tax rate, which they reduced from 39.6 down to 37 in the middle of good economic times. Why would you do that? They just want to give back money to their base. So we need to raise the top rate again. They're back to 39.6. We need to raise the corporate tax. We need to get rid of loopholes. We need to encourage investment in America, not overseas.
And it's an investment in the country. I mean, that's really the bottom line. It's an investment in the country. Congressman, in terms of Labor Caucus leadership, it is an all-Democrat group. Can you see an opening to do bipartisan work on the issues this caucus is dealing with?
I see there's about 10 really good Republicans on labor issues. They're typically most affiliated with building trade unions, like the carpenters, the plumbers, the steam fitters, the laborers, the electricians. But they've been there for like the PRO Act and for other pro-labor type of agenda items. They come from typically mature industrial states that have a legacy of unions. And they have middle class, working class constituents. So there's a few members there. But, my objective with the Labor Caucus, and as well as my colleagues, we really need the Democrats to get their act together. Okay, I don't care if you're a progressive and you're pushing for climate change all the time and immigration reform all the time. Okay, that's good. But let's look at how this affects working people in America right now. And so they need to get with that. And the moderates, the pro-trade, free trade, expand our markets. Okay, that's fine. But how's it going to affect working people in our country every day? So we need everybody who's looking at these issues from the lens of a Democratic perspective to say, how does this affect people who go to work every day, who want to work hard and want to get a decent life in return for working hard?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Let's take a look at the rest of the country. There is concern that a disaffection within the white working class is fueling right-wing extremism. And if that's true, obviously Donald Trump didn't help.
Oh,
to what extent is this? Yeah, right. That may have been the understatement of this program.
Right.
To what extent is this a concern of yours?
It's a real concern. There's a couple different factors. First of all, there's this unhappiness that exists for some people. They just don't have good lives. They feel like they've been left behind, and they're very susceptible to people saying the system's rigged, or they're stealing the election, or all these. It's more like there's structural problems that have happened over a long period of time related to globalization and technology. I believe they're not like it wasn't like some big conspiracy by the rich guys to hurt the working people. But that's been the effect. But I don't think it was planned. I think it was more just the result of globalization and technology. But, people are unhappy. That's where you start. Then you get the Congress, for example. Congress has a 15% approval rating, but there's like a 90% reelection rate. How is that possible? What's wrong? Well, most of the seats are safe in Congress. Out of the 435 seats, 385 are safe seats. If you're the Republican in the Republican district, the Democrat in the Democratic district, you're going to win. Because their seats are gerrymandered. They packed all the Republicans over there, they packed all the Democrats over there, and the Republican wins in the Republican seat, the Democrat wins in the Democratic seat. But the only way they can lose is by losing a primary. Nobody votes in the primaries. Very few people vote in the primaries. Less than 15% of the registered voters vote in the primaries. Who are those people? Well, they're the people that are the most agitated, the most exercised, the most passionate about particular issues. For Republicans, it's the far right. For the Democrats, it's the far left. So the people in these safe seats are pandering to their base, which are at the extremes, instead of doing the stuff in the middle, which is where the solutions are. So we're being pulled to the extremes. Then you add on top of that cable news networks, really a relatively new phenomenon, but They're pandering. Fox News over here, MSNBC over there. They only have 3 million, 4 million viewers, but it's not like the old days where it was journalism. Remember the movie Broadcast News, I think it was? It became entertainment. You're just trying to get people to watch so you can sell to your advertisers. It's not journalism ethics. It's selling. It's entertainment. So they're pulling us to the extremes. Then you put on top of that social media. Who are the people most active on social media? It's the people that are the most extreme. So they have the most radical messages. So they're further pulling apart. And then worst of all, scariest of all, of any of these factors are our foreign adversaries. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, using social media, using fake accounts, and spreading messages to promote disunity in America. They want to sow civil unrest. They want people fighting with each other. They want people hating each other. If you got Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter, yeah, let's pump that up. Let's get everybody fighting with each other. Evangelicals versus the people that are secular, yeah, let's pump that up. Whatever it is, make it the extreme voice and then show it over and over again on social media. And people are like, oh, I don't recognize this world. How is this so? Most people are just normal people that want to just work together to solve problems. But they did a study called Hidden Tribes. I won't go to the whole thing, but the biggest group are in the middle, 52% of Americans, which are politically disengaged and politically disenchanted. They just, it all stinks. I'm sick of the whole thing. Why are they all fighting with each other? Nobody can do it. Because people are trying to exacerbate these differences, whether it's in the primaries, social media, cable news, or our foreign adversaries. They're trying to pull us apart, and it's working.
Sadly, they're very good at what they do.
And the far right is much worse than the far left. Let me make that clear. The extremists storming the Capitol. I was in the Capitol that day, and it was a pretty scary day.
A horrible day for our country, for sure, and glad that you are safe. Before we let you go, as President Biden tries to get his infrastructure plan through Congress, you've taken a stand that you will not support the massive spending plan unless the SALT deduction is restored. Of course, the acronym refers to state and local tax deduction. Why is this an issue you're willing to go to the mat for, and why should progressive Democrats care about this?
This was a direct assault on progressive states, okay? The state and local taxes are higher in my state of New York. They're higher in California. They're higher in New Jersey. They're higher in Illinois. They're higher in, Minnesota or Michigan. They're higher in certain places. Why? Because they're progressive places, okay? We have a mass transit system, produces enormous wealth, makes people's lives better, lower carbon footprint, but it costs a lot of money. We have less people. We have less children that are uninsured in New York. One of the lowest rates of uninsured children, one of the lowest rates of uninsured adults, because we expanded the Medicaid program to get more people insured. But it costs a lot of money. When the federal government was just talking about climate change for the past 30 years, we were doing things like climate change in New York and in California, trying to address these issues by using alternative forms of energies, of retrofitting our buildings. That costs more money. We pay our teachers well. We pay our civil servants well. Costs more money. All these things cost more money. We have higher local taxes. Now, despite that, we are the biggest net donor to the federal government. We send more money to the federal government than we get back. Why would you penalize states for doing progressive policies by taking away their state and local tax deduction? That's why the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the Association of Counties, a bunch of governors, the teachers, the firefighters, the police officers, they all think we should have a state and local tax deduction. I'm going to fight to get it back. I support the president. I was the first Democrat to publicly endorse the president when he announced his candidacy. He announced at 7 a.m. I endorsed him at 7:30 that same morning. I support a big, bold infrastructure package, but I will not vote for it. No SALT, no deal. If you don't deal with the fact that we got our state and local tax deduction capped at $10,000, I'm not supporting this deal. So we're in the conversation now. We're going to be having some meetings this week in Ways and Means and with the White House, and we're talking about where we can find the deal on this.
Congressman Tom Suozzi, representing the 3rd Congressional District in New York, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Congressman, we thank you for your time with us today. Would love to have you back again soon.
Anytime. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, working on the front lines of the legal battle to protect the right to vote. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
It's time for America to go back to the future of true greatness created by people united to build a strong nation for the common good. From the start of our United States, Americans have backed leaders who dared to do big public projects. Jefferson, Lincoln, TR, FDR, Truman, Ike, JFK, and LBJ all dared to achieve bold goals. It's only since Ronald Reagan's government is evil demagoguery that our presidents and lawmakers shrivel to no-can-do mediocrities, unwilling even to try tackling America's big needs or invest in our people's unlimited possibilities. Their failure is why our nation's infrastructure, once world-class, has deteriorated to an embarrassing 16th in the world. It's hard to muster any national pride in chanting, "We're number 16." But surprise, here comes Joe, a lifelong go-slow Democrat, unexpectedly proposing a get-serious, roll-up-our-sleeves $2 trillion package of investments to modernize and extend America's collapsing infrastructure. In addition to roads, bridges, and dams, it gives a long-overdue boost to such needs as rural high-speed broadband and providing affordable child care facilities, all geared to creating good union jobs and lifting local economies. Even more transformative is Biden's Back to the Future method of paying for this Rebuild America agenda by returning to progressive taxation. Instead of the same old no-tax, laissez-faire extremism that Washington has practiced for 40 years, Biden will at long last demand that multinational corporate behemoths stop dodging their tax obligations to America. It's the same fair tax policy that funded our nation's real needs in the past, while also increasing productivity and raising living standards for millions of working families. This is Jim Hightower saying, let's do it again. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is brought to you by our new Lowdown Happy Hour, now live streaming on Facebook from the Chat and Chew Cafe, with kick-ass political spark plugs like Beto O'Rourke, musical champions like Marcia Ball, and grassroots change makers like the New Georgia Project and People's Action. The Lowdown Happy Hour is reaching out to you to help put the move in movement. So grab a libation and join the fun. Details at hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. The battle to protect voting rights is playing out in courtrooms and legislative halls across the country right now. Attorney Caleb Jackson says that even when the courts don't side with voters, the fight is far from over. And we say hello to Caleb Jackson, who serves as legal counsel on voting rights at the Campaign Legal Center. Caleb Jackson, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. As stated on the website of the Campaign Legal Center, the purpose of the organization is to advance democracy through law. And in terms of voting rights, man, what a remarkable time it is to be a part of that fight. Looking out across the national horizon, how serious is the current threat to voting rights?
I'd say it's more serious than it's been in a while, in decades even. Um, you know, After 2020, we saw a concerted effort, unlike anything I think we've ever seen in this country, to overturn the results of a presidential election that was accurate, that was fair, that was secure. And since that time, we've seen state legislators, governors, secretary of states encourage laws to restrict the right to vote on the basis of the myth that the 2020 election wasn't secure. And so, I think that it's more dangerous than ever because usually, we have every year these state legislators trying to pass these laws, but they don't have quite the fuel that they have this year, which is, this huge myth that unfortunately a lot of people in this country believe that the 2020 election was not secure, which is completely incorrect.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to take it a step further and call that myth a lie.
Yeah,
I just,
sure.
I mean, that's just,
Absolutely.
I mean, it's crazy. All right. So let's zero in on Georgia. Obviously, there's a great deal of debate over why that state decided to take such draconian approach to voting. Republicans, of course, say it's about protecting voter integrity. What's a more accurate way of understanding this push to restrict voting in Georgia?
Yeah, I think a more accurate way to describe it is just how, election officials in Georgia described it at the time. Secretary of State Raffensperger at the time said, quote, "At the end of the day, many of these bills are reactionary to a 3-month disinformation campaign that could have been prevented." Now, that's what he said when these bills were pending in the legislature. After they passed, of course, he, came out and said, "Oh, well, I actually support these now." But it's clear that that's exactly what this bill was, specifically SB 202, a huge reactionary measure, solutions in search of a problem.
Yeah. What's amazing to me is because the 2020 election ran so well, and we had, we dealt with COVID, and so there were drop boxes and things, to a degree that we'd never seen before, but it all worked well. It was all secure. That's more reason to encourage that, not discourage it. And that's exactly what that bill does. It takes those things away. Sure, they increased hours a little bit on certain times, and that's kind of their one crutch that they have to lean on. But I mean, this is obviously keeping people from having the opportunity to vote.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, things like a lot of things that aren't getting a lot of coverage, like things like requiring drop boxes to be in physical early voting locations. Well, that completely defeats the purpose of a drop box. If it has to be in an early voting location, then that's no different than requiring someone to go to a polling place. So there are a ton of restrictions. The bill is, as nearly 100 pages, and it's completely unnecessary. Once again, it's, there are solutions in search of a problem that, like you identified, was a big lie, a huge myth. And it's just unreasonable, unnecessary, and, seeking to target voters in areas that, were able to flip Georgia, which the people in power in Georgia apparently didn't like.
Yeah, I think that might be an understatement. And Caleb, turning to how to fight these efforts of voter suppression, there are already several lawsuits challenging Georgia's new voting law over its discriminatory impact on voters of color. What will the plaintiffs have to prove to win these lawsuits?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a variety of lawsuits. Some, as you said, challenging the discriminatory impact on voters of color from an impact perspective. So not saying that, this law was intentionally written to stop Black and brown people from voting. There's also a lawsuit that does include an intent claim and say this law was intentionally written to discriminate against voters of color. It's harder to prove that, it was intentionally written to do that, especially after they did things like remove the ban on Sunday voting, which a court in the Fourth Circuit had already ruled was, a huge smoking gun indicative of an intent to stop specifically Black churchgoers from voting. But it's not impossible to improve intent. There may be something that, in the course of this litigation comes out and proves that intent, which I would say from a common sense perspective, it's pretty clear, but from a legal perspective, it's sometimes hard to prove.
Yeah.
And then on the impact basis, they'll just have to prove that, look, they knew that these rules or these new provisions were going to have a discriminatory impact on Black voters. It's clear that that's the case, and they passed this bill anyway. That is sometimes hard to prove nowadays as well, but it's much easier to prove than intent.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking to Caleb Jackson, who serves as legal counsel on voting rights at the Campaign Legal Center. And let's turn to a more positive note. Virginia Governor Northam recently signed into law the Voting Rights Act of Virginia. But that begs a question. We already have a federal law to protect voting rights. It's the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Why should it fall on states such as Virginia or others to enact their own laws to protect voting rights?
Yeah, so that's a great question, right? We think that we had this fight already. People already marched for this. People already died for this. Why are states like Virginia and also New York, considering passing their own voting rights acts? And that's because of the United States Supreme Court. In 2013, the Supreme Court, in a case called Shelby County v. Holder, basically stripped Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which is the preclearance provision. And that's something that this Virginia Voting Rights Act would require, right? So what preclearance is saying before an election official, either on a county level or on the city level, makes a change to voting or a change to elections, this would include something like closing a polling place or, consolidating a polling place or, moving a polling place to a different location. They would have to get preclearance for that from the state of Virginia. It also allows Virginians who feel like a voting law or voting practice, either on the local or state level, is discriminating against them on the basis of race, to file a lawsuit under this new law. Now, the reason that's important is because, unfortunately, after the Supreme Court gutted, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, the Supreme Court also is not favorable to lawsuits under Section 5 because it's basically, toothless. And then there's also, unfortunately, another case dealing with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which specifically deals with, what we were just talking about, discriminatory impact against voters of color. And that case is currently pending in the Supreme Court. That's the Brnovich case. And, we're honestly unclear how the Supreme Court will rule. But if they rule, in a similar manner to the way they ruled in Shelby County v. Holder, then, that could also strip the teeth out of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So that's two major provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that people have historically used to fight or protect voting rights that are no longer, or may, I should say, because Section 2 isn't gone yet, but may possibly be unavailable for people going forward to, protect their voting rights. So it's super important for states like Virginia to be passing their own voting rights acts, because it gives people an alternative way to, ensure that their right to vote is being protected.
It's just frustrating that they need to. That
Absolutely.
We have a Voting Rights Act. We've had it for a long time, and but kudos to Virginia for doing so.
For sure.
Do you see Virginia's new law perhaps being a model for the rest of the nation?
Yeah, I think so. I think it is a model requiring preclearance. I think that, especially because Virginia, was the former seat of the Confederacy. So not just nationwide, but specifically for states in the South. Maybe one day Georgia would pass one of its own. North Carolina, some of these other states that we're seeing, be more progressive, at least with who they elect, if not with the laws that they're passing. So hopefully it can be a model to the entire country, but specifically to some of those states in the South.
Yeah. And, we also have, and I think it's important to point out, movement at the national level with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, the For the People Act. How important is it to get these bills passed? And can you see that happening?
Yeah, so I mean, it's super important to begin with. The John Lewis Voting Rights Restoration Act specifically would repair what the Supreme Court did in Shelby County v. Holder, which I was just talking about. It would create this new formula that would basically put the bite back into Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So that's extremely important. And HR 1 is equally, if not more so important, because HR 1, along with including important voting rights provisions, also includes important, campaign finance provisions to get dark money out of politics. It would, require states to offer same-day voter registration, which is a huge problem, and do all kinds of things that would make voting easier, more accessible for all voters in this country. So it's imperative that these things are passed. These bills are passed, rather. I can't speak to right now, whether they will pass or not. I can just say that I sure do hope they do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I think there are plenty of us that feel the same way.
Yeah, of course.
Now, before we let you go, you've spoken about what led you to become a voting rights attorney, and it's the influence of your grandfather, Clifford Jackson. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, so, my grandfather, my father's father, Clifford Jackson, he was one of the founders of the Progressive Voters League in Dallas, Texas, in the, mid 1930s. And he was active in the organization, in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. And, what they did at that time in Texas, there were two provisions or two laws that really prohibited Black people from voting. First, in Texas at the time, primary elections were all white. So they, let Black people vote in the general election, but they didn't let Black people vote in the primary election. So, basically Black voters had no, role in deciding who was actually going to end up on the ticket for the general election. So at the end of the day, allowing them to vote in the general election was kind of a farce. The second thing that, the Progressive Voters League and my grandfather really worked to fight against were the poll taxes in Texas. At the time, Black people still had to pay poll taxes. And, this is a period in our country where the courts, whether you're talking about the courts in Texas, the Fifth Circuit, the Supreme Court, none of them were on the side of Black voters at the time. And so knowing that they didn't have the courts on their side, they collected poll taxes for Black voters in Texas, specifically in the Dallas area. So they pulled organizations together, helped collect money, and they paid the poll taxes for Black voters who couldn't afford to pay them on their own. And they ultimately were able to get some real political power and get some real changes in Dallas and really influence the election, even with these barriers in place. So, that was a huge motivation for me to become a voting rights lawyer. And especially, when we take losses, whether that's at, the lower court level or even at the Supreme Court, it gives me the motivation to know that even if the courts aren't on your side, the fight isn't over and we can't stop fighting to ensure that all Americans have the right to vote.
Caleb, we appreciate your grandfather, Clifford. We certainly appreciate the work that you're doing as well, and we appreciate your time with us today. Caleb Jackson serves as legal counsel on voting rights at the Campaign Legal Center. Caleb, thank you so much. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Thank you so much, Jim. I'd love to be back. Just let me know when.
You got it. Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press with Julian Castro on our nation's border crisis. What should be done now and what should be done in the future?
Everybody's talking about this crisis now at the border. From your perspective, and you've certainly been dealing with this issue for a long time, how do you see the situation at the border today? How serious is it?
Well, look, we have thousands of young people, children who do not have their parents with them, unaccompanied minors, who have presented themselves at the border, who are now in federal government custody. So there's an urgency to make sure that these children who are in our custody are treated humanely, they're treated compassionately, that they're taken out of these CBP facilities that are very overcrowded. And, as the Biden administration has said, this is no place for kids to live. And you want to find them relatives that usually live here in the United States and have them stay there while their asylum claim is adjudicated. So we have to make sure that the people who are in our custody, who are seeking asylum, that they're treated with common sense and with compassion. And the Biden administration, I think, is doing a much, much better job, of course, than Donald Trump did there. And then you also have the issue of, we've seen migration like this. These high numbers of people coming from Central America several times in the last few years. People will remember 2014 under President Obama, 2019 under President Trump, and now in 2021 under President Biden. We have to get at the root cause of this. And that means, what I called for in my campaign was a 21st century Marshall Plan for Central America, so that you work with these countries in the Northern Triangle so people can find safety, security, and opportunity at home instead of feeling compelled to make that dangerous journey to the southern border. And on that score, I also think that the Biden administration is doing a good job walking down that path. When Biden was vice president, he led the effort to invest $750 million in these Northern Triangle countries and strike better partnerships, relationships with them, and improve conditions there. They're trying to build on that now after Trump basically rolled that back in his administration. So all in all, we're not where we need to be, but what you see with the Biden administration is a common sense approach, a more compassionate approach, and competence. And so I'm confident that they can manage this. I don't see this as something we just can't handle or a crisis in the way that most people think of that. It's not a national security crisis. If there's any crisis, it's a humanitarian one, and making sure that people are treated humanely. And then finally, Bill, I would say I have never bought into the idea that a 16-year-old child or a family that is coming here seeking a better life is somehow a threat to this country, a national security threat, an economic threat, or a cultural threat. But that's what the right wing has been selling for generations. And I think that as a country, we need to be big enough to call that out and to reject it.
I mean, just the fact that you use the word treat these kids and the others, everyone coming, humanely and with compassion, those two words are words we didn't hear under the last 4 years, correct? I mean, that in itself is a major difference in dealing with the problem.
Oh, it's night and day. Yeah. And, I'm very pleased that Joe Biden has said that, has said we're not going to turn our back on these children. We're going to live up to our values. Donald Trump treated families, including little kids. People will remember that audio of the little girl crying for her father, in 2018. Those images, that image of a little girl behind her mom. It looked like next to a police cruiser in the middle of the night, with the floodlights on, looking lost and crying. He treated these folks as less than human. He treated them cruelly in all of our names. And, that's terrible in and of itself. It's also terrible because the whole thing didn't work. He was committing cruelty with the idea, I suppose, that was going to deter more families from coming. But that utterly failed too. Now Biden is taking a more common sense approach of saying, no, look, we're going to live up to our values as Americans and how we treat people, but we need to take a smarter long-term approach so that we don't see these patterns, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And the only way that you're going to get to that, you're going to do that is getting at the root cause of creating safety and opportunity in those home countries.
Well, let's talk about that for a while. The root cause, I mean, because I think a lot of Americans have a hard time understanding this is such a difficult journey. This is definitely not a guarantee that even if they get to the border, they'll get in. So people have a hard time understanding what is it that is driving these people to make that sacrifice and to make that decision to come that tremendous distance on the odds of getting into the United States. You know, what's pushing them here?
Well, there are a number of conditions in these countries. Deep poverty, there's gang violence, the threat of violence. You have many of them who say that they've been targeted by violent gangs over there. Sometimes it's scarcity. You know, as I said, the poverty. At different times, Central American migration has been influenced by conflict. So you have many different things that have, compelled people to make that dangerous journey. And it is a dangerous journey. You have people that die along the way, people that never make it to the southern border. And then even if they do, the vast, vast majority of people, even who are allowed into the United States to claim asylum, do not get to stay in the United States. And they certainly must know that through word of mouth from families and people that get sent back. So it tells you how desperate they must be to still make that journey, knowing that the chances are very slim that they're actually going to get to this land of opportunity and of freedom in the United States.
And there are also people, aren't there, that are in the business of lying to them, basically saying,
that's
hey,
true.
Everything's changed. Yeah. Biden's a nice guy. Come on, everybody's welcome. Now's the time to come. And they're just taking advantage of people.
Yeah, correct? I mean, there is a cottage industry of coyotes, of people who make money trying to smuggle folks across the border. I mean, that's been true for a very long time. And of course, not only folks from Central America, but from Mexico and from other places. But they've done that, one administration to the next, Republican and Democrat. And they've lied to them when Trump was they're trying to make money. So they've lied to them about their chances when Trump was the president or when Obama was the president. And I'm sure they're lying to them now, giving them this false hope that everything is going to be fine. At the same time, there's those genuine reasons why a mom would pick up her 8-year-old kid and take that kid on this dangerous journey. I mean, anybody would know, right? Like, if you can stay at home and have what you need there in your own land, then you're probably going to stay at home. You don't just take up on that journey for no good reason. Even if you have these coyotes suggesting that you could get in, right? If people have what they need where they're at, they're going to be there where their home is. Nobody likes to just leave home. And so what we need to do in the long run is we need to work with Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala so that people can have greater safety and opportunity there at home. And, recognizing that the United States has a checkered past in these countries. There's a lot of skepticism.
Indeed. So, Mr. Secretary, first of all, in his news conference last week, the president sort of joked about this. Boy, they're not just coming here. This isn't the first time, right? And they're not just coming here because I'm a nice guy. You also pointed out we had a surge at the border under President Obama. We had a surge at the border under President Trump. We had a surge at the border under previous presidents. Do you think that the Biden administration maybe failed to anticipate this problem or realize it was coming and prepare for it?
There was a failure of the Trump administration in the transition and the handoff. The Biden administration, or the Biden transition officials, for instance, requested of the Health and Human Services Secretary that they prepare more space for additional migrants that were anticipated. And that request or that call by the HHS secretary was not made until a week or two before Biden took office, very late. On top of that, there are court documents that show that the Trump administration fully expected, projected that we would see this quote unquote surge of migrants at this time, because in part it is, cyclical, seasonal. I'm sure if you asked Biden administration officials now, look, if you had to go back 3 months ago, what would you do differently? Is there anything you would do? There are always things that could be done, with hindsight a little bit differently. But the main failure here was the failure of the Trump administration to successfully prepare during that transition to stonewall the Biden folks, to not give them information they needed. And because of that, we find ourselves playing catch up right now.
Right. I think one thing, Mr. Secretary, we've also discovered is that the big Trump fence is not as effective as he said it was, right?
Oh, I know. Yeah, I saw that picture about a week ago. Somebody cut the lower end. They cut the lower end of those thick fence poles, but they're able to get right through. It's just ridiculous, Bill. We've been sold a bill of goods by the right wing to scare everybody about the people that are coming here, and also to create a siege mentality, and to put money into border protection methods like that fence or wall or whatever we want to call it, that are fundamentally not effective. I believe that we need to make sure that, of course, we enforce our border. Every country is going to have a border, but I think there's smarter ways that we can do it, through the use of technology, through the right use of manpower, and certainly through common sense and being smart. That's not what Trump was into. Trump was into ginning up his base, and the wall was more than just a physical thing. It was symbolic.
Bill Press with Julian Castro. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Representative Tom Suozzi, Caleb Jackson, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.